when it comes to hiring, I think one of the first steps is to identify what you're lacking and create the role you need in your company.
I love bookkeeping.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for listening to the I Love Bookkeeping podcast. My name is Hannah Robinson.
And I'm Melissa Honan.
And thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss an episode out every Tuesday and Thursday. Today, we're going to be continuing our series on scaling your business, and we're going to take a deep dive into hiring and firing. I feel like these are obviously two completely on the opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to your employees, but it's so important to talk about, especially the firing part, because that can be really difficult and it can be really uncomfortable, but sometimes it's necessary and sometimes hiring is necessary. So we're going to take a deep dive into both of these subjects today when it comes to scaling your business. Melissa, you've obviously done both hiring and firing. Which, just to kick this off, which is easier, you think?
Neither. What
They're
is
both
the
really
it's the saying
difficult.
like slow to hire, quick to fire is what it's supposed to be, because the idea is that if you're slow to hire, you'll be less likely to have to fire. I've seen, I have to be honest, like my weakness is firing people. I hold on to people for way too long. And it wasn't until one of the nicest members of my team, who I never thought she would be like ruthless, but she was like, no, you need to fire this person like immediately. And I was like, well, and she's like, well, think about it this way. Like when you hold on to people that you should let go, what you're doing is putting additional work and stress on your top performers. Because typically when you need to fire somebody because of performance, their inability to do their job or whatever issue that they're causing is not just, it's just not, just them. It's not just affecting them. It's affecting the people around you and the rest of your team.
Yeah.
And it will affect your company culture for sure. So I've gotten better at that. I would say, obviously, I prefer to hire, but it's not easy. Oh my God. I literally just watched, guys, 17 Loom videos on people applying to be an account manager. And it's just so hard, because it's like, you want to see the good in everybody, but then it's like, I cannot interview 17 people. So I got to narrow this shit down. Right. And then I think there's ways with processes to make it easier, but it took us a really long time to get there.
Yeah. And I feel like they're both really hard. Like it's really hard. Hiring people is tough because you kind of have to create an onboarding process and you kind of have to identify what you're lacking, and you have all these different people that want to work for you, and the interview process can be long and strenuous. But firing I feel like it's equally hard. Like there's no right answer to the question I just asked you, because both are very hard. But I think to kick this off, when it comes to hiring, I think one of the first steps is to identify what you're lacking and create the role you need in your company. Is that normally how you go about hiring?
Yeah. I mean, really just start with the job description. And it's so funny because I'm actually revamping my hiring process right now, like as we're doing it, because I'm working myself completely out of it. And so I'm already out of the hiring process for the bookkeeping team. I don't have anything to do with it. Y'all don't want to meet with me anyway. I have nothing to contribute to this department. But I do assist with the other departments hiring right now. And so the first step of, our hiring process is to, identify the role that needs to be hired, and then to review the job description, the job like requirements and responsibilities, and make any modifications that are necessary. Because even though, the positions pretty much stay the same, but eventually, the positions can evolve over time, and you want to make sure that you're accurately describing the role that applicants are applying for. So I always like to just do a review of the job description before I go to post it, just in case I feel like, we actually now have, this new process in place that includes this specific thing. And I want to make sure that people are aware that that's, part of the requirements of the job.
Do you feel like you're able to really get clear on what you need? And is that hard to communicate during the hiring process? Like, is it easier to kind of find someone? Is it easier to get clear first on what you need and fill that role that's really hard to fill? Or do you feel like it's easier to give people tasks as you hire them? Like if you, let's say you need someone to do sales and to do a little bit of copywriting. Like let's say you need these two things. Do you find that it's easier to just let people know right off the bat, like, hey, you may have to do some of this work, or you may have to do something that maybe isn't totally in the normal job description? Or do you feel like it's easier to hire people and then later on ask them if they can take on a different task?
No, I think it all needs to be very clear up front.
Yeah.
And if you're not sure what the position is, then just say that up front. But I hate when people know what they want and they don't communicate it ahead of time. And then it just comes out of left field for the person that you just hired. Yeah, I think that just being as clear as possible. That's why a lot of times too, I always include like a Loom video when I'm hiring where I go over, the application a little bit more and I just kind of explain the things that I feel like are really hard to put in writing, because I think that is really hard. I think it took me so long. It took our team so long to, originally write and modify the job descriptions because I was like, I don't know how I want to write this down, right? Like, what if I'm not like properly describing what this is? So, it took a really long time and I feel like it doesn't encapsulate everything. So I do always like to have, a video that just kind of goes over, I guess, more of like the things that are just harder to put into writing.
Yeah. Well, and I asked that because I feel like that's a big pain point, especially for new business owners, is they have these little, if you first get clear on the tasks you need help with and it's kind of all over the map, I think that's a big pain point because you need someone to fill ultimately this big role of like sales or marketing or another bookkeeper, but you also need these other little tasks that maybe not everybody wants to do,
Yeah. And then you say that and I've done that so many times, like literally my example of the client success manager, going to them and saying, I know I need this role to help with onboarding. And I know it's going to include a bunch of other stuff I'm not thinking about now. Like, are y'all cool with that? Like, we're going to just figure this out together. And they were like, yeah. But if I had hired them and I said, hey, you're just going to be onboarding clients. And then I added a bunch of like, oh, well, I also need your help with marketing. And I also need your help with, our non-meeting clients and making sure that we get the administrative tasks for the team. And I also need your help with some of our automation, and just started adding different things. Like that's not what they signed up for, right? So I think going in and saying, hey, this is going to be fluid and things are going to make, just also setting the right environment where it's okay for them to also decline, right? Because, when I revamped our client success department and I added a few different things to it, I let everybody know ahead of time, like, hey, I want people in this department to help me with sales and marketing, but I'm not wanting all of you to help me with sales and marketing. Because if sales and marketing, terrifies you and you absolutely hate that, I don't want you to hate your job. So just know that, if you don't tell them something ahead of time, they should be able to reject it and you should accept that. And if you don't, that's not good.
So when it comes time for a new hire, how did you create processes and structure so that it's more of like a seamless shift when somebody new comes on board?
Oh, I messed it up enough times.
Okay. So how did you tell me about how you messed it up?
For sure. So let me get like specific examples, like bringing on new bookkeepers, just from like, capacity sake. We would have like multiple people on board, new team members, depending on their capacity, right? And it was like written down, but it wasn't like super clear and everybody kind of had a different way of doing things and we weren't all quite on the same page. So bookkeepers would come on and maybe like 90% of the process would be explained to them, but the other 10% wouldn't be. And then, depending on the person, they might have a, better like rapport with one person than another. And so we found that, if people onboarded with one person, they were more successful than with another. And vice versa sometimes, because it was really like personality oriented. And so we really had to like try to revamp our written processes to include more like videos, screenshots, descriptions, like different types of mediums. So that way there would be like less subjectivity in like how a person would explain a process. Does that make sense? Yeah. Like, so just trying to like, instead of looking at it from like, oh, we just need to get them the information, we're really just switching to like an education standpoint where it's like, okay, we know that people learn different ways. How can we make sure that the information is given in all of these different ways so that depending on how the new hire learns, they get the best information to be successful in their job. And then we also did create multiple points where people do meet with several different people now instead of just one, so that they do kind of have like almost like a round robin on the team, so that we can make, if they don't have rapport with one person, maybe they'll have rapport with another. But then also they have multiple points of contact that they feel comfortable to reach out to if they have questions.
That's really cool that you do that, because it's like, there's so much uncertainty, I feel like, when somebody new comes on board, if those processes aren't in place or if that communication isn't in place. And so I think it's really great to have as much structure as possible, especially for your entire team, so that it's like a really seamless process.
And I don't think it'll ever be seamless, but I think that being transparent in your communication about who is primarily responsible for the onboarding of that new employee and the training and then the ongoing, management, depending on what the department is. Cause like we've definitely had failed onboardings, where processes weren't followed, but also people weren't necessarily held accountable for, what was part of their job and onboarding a new employee. But it went on for so long because we did not have like, top to bottom checklist of like, okay, does the operations team check in with this department manager to make sure that their onboardings are going successfully? So we now have like a lot of redundancies in place. And there's still times where it kind of, things get off schedule, right? Things get off schedule and things aren't quite, as seamless as they could be. But I think if you're like keeping on top of it, so like, for instance, again, we meet weekly as a team. And so every week when we're onboarding people, we get a status on, okay, how's onboarding? Are you on track? Are you off track? Do you need help with something? Do we need to coordinate on schedule? And then we just, treat it as if it's any other project that we would be managing.
Today's show is brought to you by Keeper, the one app to run your bookkeeping business. Keeper helps you get faster client responses with your own custom branded QuickBooks integrated client portal. Finally, you can say goodbye to those pesky spreadsheets full of uncategorized transactions. Keeper also helps you catch those embarrassing coding errors before your clients do. And with Keeper, you can generate beautiful custom reports that your clients will absolutely love to read. To find out more, go to keeper.app. That's keeper.app. Mention I Love Bookkeeping to get 20% off your first 3 months. Again, go to keeper.app to find out more. Thank you for listening.
I also think it's so great when you're hiring, and if a process change, or if the process is changing, or if there's a new role in place or something, I think it's really important to communicate that with your entire team, because I've definitely seen problems with companies where you have more established employees that are kind of under the assumption that they've been grandfathered in to certain roles. And so I think it's great to communicate updates with your processes or with onboarding with your entire team and make sure that it applies to everyone. Because I think we've all, no matter what type of job it is, I think we've all been in a place where somebody is established and they're under the assumption that they're grandfathered in with a certain set of rules. And I think it's super important to be really upfront with your communication on what's going on as a boss. And I think that's such a trait. I think that's such a great trait of a good boss, is to be able to communicate and make sure that both old and new members of your team are happy and are doing their job efficiently, but are also following like the current guidelines.
For sure. I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, and I see that with almost every company that I've come across, or any like business owner that I've talked to, or just kind of any place I've worked. I feel like that's a big That's a big issue. And you wouldn't think that it is because it's kind of sounds like an issue of politics, but really it's just kind of a lack of communication of processes and guidelines. So I feel like that's so important if you're out there and you have maybe an older employee or not older in age, but more established employee, and you're hiring somebody new, make sure everybody is following the same guidelines and following the same processes, because I think that creates kind of tension in the workplace when you see the rules applied to one person and not applied to another person. I've found that that's a really tough thing. And especially for a new hire, I think that's one of the best ways to make your new hire happy and to make sure that they're enjoying your place of work is to make sure that everyone is adhering by the same guidelines. But kind of to jump to the next step of hiring, how do you go about training a new employee, especially working virtually? Like what are the best ways, the most efficient ways you find are ways to train your employee, especially virtual?
Yeah, it depends on the position, but it is definitely a mix of self-paced training, videos, written training, in-person meetings, and just trying to have a mix of, work that they can complete on their own with like specific deadlines on when it needs to be done, and like in-person and team trainings. We've seen a lot more success with new hires when they have more face-to-face time. And so like, for instance, in like my department, I started to have like 30-minute meetings Monday through Friday, where it was like just like a daily check-in. I got this idea from Melissa Lang, who I think she does it primarily like via Slack. But I was like, no, like I want people to be able, if they want to come and see my face, I'm there. So every morning for 30 minutes, I'm in my Zoom room, whether they come or not. Whereas like Wednesday is like the official meeting day. And so the other departments have started to do something similar, like the bookkeeping department. And it's just really good, I think, for new hires, especially like you make it, they need to be in those meetings. They need to come to check in until they're out of their onboarding process, because it really gives them the face-to-face time, building rapport, not only with you, but anybody else that shows up to that meeting in the morning. So I think it's really, really important to just have as much face time as possible, but obviously to be as efficient with your time still. So, mixing it up with different mediums of how to learn.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like that's so important, especially when working virtually, is finding what works best for your employee and what your favorite mode of communication is, what their favorite mode of communication is, and kind of finding common ground on communication. On the flip side, firing. So you said that you tend to struggle with hanging on to employees maybe a little bit too long. What is something that's kind of a clear indicator to you that it's time to let somebody go?
So we've made this easier. We've tried to make it as objective as possible through metrics so that I can't talk myself out of firing somebody. And so, like, for instance, the bookkeeping QC, they get so many strikes for so many, numbers of unsatisfactory items on their QC. We have, a no, like a kind of like, I can't think of the word that I'm trying to think of, but like, no exception kind of to timeliness for bookkeeping. So if they are late for an assignment and they have not notified us ahead of time, we'll let them go immediately. Now, this is for obviously new people, not necessarily, senior people. But I honestly, I've never had a senior person just not do their work. So that's the thing too, right? Is like having expectations. So like if, a new person is going to be late on an assignment, but they let their, department head know, like, hey, I actually was struggling with time this month. I didn't realize with all these new processes, I thought I could handle it, but I couldn't. They're not going to be fired. But if they just don't complete their work, then yeah, we're not going to let them continue. So that kind of having just like objective metrics where it's like, if this, then this, has made it a lot easier. I have made exceptions. But usually that's like, I will have several, we'll have meetings with people, obviously, before we let them go, where we set standards of expectations that need to meet to improve. And so I feel like we give them every opportunity to improve. And then if we get to the point where it's like, okay, if you do not do this, then we're going to need to talk about decreasing your workload or parting ways. Well, if they get to that point, then, it's really on them, right? Like, so if you're communicating over and over and over again what you need from them and they're consistently not doing it, then they've made up their minds, right? So my recommendation is that really have all of the like objective measurements written down, like what would be I need to fire this person, and then stick to it as much as you can.
Yeah. So how do you go about firing somebody? Like, this is kind of like getting to the nitty gritty of like letting employees go. It's obviously very hard to do, especially if someone is maybe a little more introverted or they don't want to hurt this person's feelings or kind of get on their bad side. But how do you go about letting someone go and kind of like maintaining their dignity and making sure that the letting go process isn't this big emotional blow up? Like how do you effectively do that?
Yeah. So I usually see the emotional blowups happen in the meetings leading up to a termination. And my communication consultant has been really great about helping me manage that. Basically, just, sticking to business, staying on topic when they try to stray and make it emotional or make it personal, try to lead them back to the topic. If they're continuing, if they're crying uncontrollably or if they start yelling or if they start pointing fingers, just remind them that this is like a professional exchange and that we need to talk about the subject that matter and not other subjects around it. Just staying as on topic as possible. And so I think that, again, once you're taking you have consistent check-ins on somebody that's having performance issues, then the actual final meeting isn't going to be a surprise to anyone, right? And so when you have that meeting, you just want to be as cut and dry as possible about what's happening with as much compassion as well. It needs to be face-to-face. It needs to be on Zoom. Do not fire somebody via email or Slack. And then really just get to it. Don't make them sit through a meeting where you go through all of the shit that they've done wrong. Like, just be, I've had to make this decision that, because of your fill in the blank of what the reason is that you're firing them. I think it would be best for us to part ways. And then just start talking through, the specifics of how it's going to work. We think, your offboarding will be effective immediately. This, that, and the other. Do you have any questions? And just like make it short, sweet, and to the point. But don't go into like, okay, well, you did this wrong and you did that wrong. Like, look, the damage is about to be done because you're about to fire them. So save the reasons that you're firing them for a termination letter or, the written counseling that you're providing upon termination. But that termination meeting should not be where you're going to tear them down before you fire them.
Yeah. And I think that's really important to keep it because it keeps your composure and it keeps their composure, because it's never fun to fire somebody. Unless you absolutely hate that person, then it might be fun for you.
I've been there in a former life, like in retail, where I was like, God, I'm so happy to get rid of this person. But like now that it's my business, it's a lot harder.
Yeah. It's tough because you don't want it. I think there's more of like the anticipation that builds up that people get worried about when it comes to firing somebody. Do you have any, like, for new business owners out there, or maybe not new business owners, but bookkeeping business owners in general, what are some indications or some indicators that tend to go through your mind when you're thinking about whether or not it's time to fire someone? Because I think if you've never really had to let somebody go, it can be hard to differentiate between, is this a phase or do I need to let this person go? And what are some ways that 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 your feelings are set in stone and that it's time to fire this person.
Yeah, I think if it's like a quality control issue, again, having those objective measurements so that if they're consistently not meeting the expectations of their position, that's obvious, right? Like we have a sheet. So like when they don't meet the expectations of the QC, it turns red. So if you see a bunch of red going across that sheet, that's going to help. I also say documentation. You need to have a document essentially every meeting that you have with them, like every regular check-in. And then, if you start to kind of get that feeling like you're not sure if they're the right fit, like review the documentation and their notes and see, what are the things that you're discussing? Because I feel like a lot of times managers kind of get wrapped up in everything that they're doing. And I don't want to say it's their fault, but a lot of times I think it can be, as business owners, our fault if somebody is not successful, if we haven't done everything in our power to help them be successful. So if you're not having regular check-ins with somebody, if you have not been appropriately communicating your expectations or appropriately communicating when somebody doesn't meet your expectations, and then 6 months later, you're like, well, I guess I just got to let them go. Like, no, dude, that's on you. Like you just spent the last 6 months not liking the work of this person and not once did you tell them that. Like that's on you, right? So I think a big thing is like, if you ever get the idea, like, I don't think that this person's working out, you also need to do a self-audit on, have you told them that? Because, my whole idea is that if I do everything that I need to do, then letting them go will be not easy, but it will be the right decision and I'll know it's the right decision. Anytime I have been unsure, it's because I did not do everything that I needed to do for them to be successful. And I had to do that first to make sure that it was a them problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah. No, and I feel like something that needs to be done is communicating as much as you possibly can. And it's hard. I don't want to say give someone as many chances as possible, but have the clear documentation so that your bases are covered when it's time to fire somebody.
And have deadlines too. So it's like not give people as many chances as possible, but it's like, hey, I expect to see this behavior improved so that this result is met. And we're going to have a check-in meeting on this date to see how you are progressing in this, and then doing it and then sticking to it. Because I see a lot of that where it's like, oh man, this is like the worst bookkeeper and I'm going to have to just get rid of them. And then it's like, well, have you ever told them what they're doing wrong? Have you ever given them the feedback or on training or things like that on what they can do to improve? And there are tons of times where I've let people go and I've done all of the things. I had like one of those Tyra Banks moments, she's like, I was rooting for you. We were all rooting for you. Like, I remember, how dare you? I was in a meeting with my business coach and I let her know, I was like, hey, I got to let so-and-so go. And she's like, damn, she's like, how much have we done to try to make this not happen? Like we had all, I literally was paying my communication consultant to meet with multiple members of my team for 6 to 12 months, depending on who it was. Tons of money, guys, paying them to meet with all the team members, sometimes multiple times a week for months on end, just let's help you. I will do what I need to do. And it was it was just lie after lie after lie. It was one of the worst experiences, but we both looked at each other and we were like, we were both rooting for you. We had a, and so that's kind of when you get to that point, you're too far gone. I should have let them go 6 months before I did. But that was
hard.
On me.
That's hard. So if you guys have comments, questions, concerns, tips about hiring and firing, or you want to hear more about this, please shoot us an email at success@ilovebookkeeping.com. Again, that's success@ilovebookkeeping.com. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss an episode out every Tuesday and Thursday. My name is Hannah Robinson.
And I'm Melissa Honan.
And thank you for tuning in to the I Love Bookkeeping podcast.
I love bookkeeping. Here's a little shout to all my friends working hard at keeping the books. You want to change your life, you want to grow that biz, it's not as hard as it looks. Be a money guide, a profit coach, step up your game and see